Hello, is that me?
Absolutely.
Yes, James, you're with us.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege listening to you for as long as I have been. Believe it or not, I started listening to you back before I went to university, which is 2014.
Wow.
So quite a while ago.
Wow.
I've been making some notes over your last few live streams. I've got a couple questions, but if I may, with respect to South Korea, man, when it came to discussing the space race with the Russians, Russian is, after all, the #1 language of space. They got there first, so it is #1 language. Also, the rocket technology is still pretty much the #1 in the world. During the 1990s, when NASA went over to check on the Baikonur Cosmodrome, they found a warehouse full of old 60s era engines. And when tested, they were about, I think it was 30 to 40% more efficient than the latest NASA ones at the time. So there is an awful lot of very rich scientific culture over when it comes to the space race.
Absolutely.
It's a bit of a moot question considering what has happened since. But with regards to Ukraine, I remember hearing that there were also mobilizations in Belarus. Just asking if you two would know anything about that, because if the Belarusian military itself was also mobilizing, that would be a bit of a bigger issue than just Russia on its own.
Well, it certainly would. I mean, there are, by the way, I mean, the Russians do have a small military presence in Belarus, but the Belarus army is obviously under Lukashenko, President Lukashenko's control, and is apparently very well organized and trained. And in recent months, Belarus has been moving ever closer towards Russia following the political crisis that happened there last year, which Lukashenko won. And of course, we've had this extraordinary story recently of an attempted coup in Belarus, which doesn't actually seem to have been a real coup in the sense that it doesn't seem to have involved the military itself, but which was apparently hatched from outside and involved some very extraordinary plans of assassination and cyber attacks and all that kind of thing, which failed dismally. But there has been talk increasingly of the Russians and the Belarusians getting together and of the Belarus military becoming more involved. Now, this is a major change because until last year, basically, Lukashenko tried to maintain a kind of equidistance between Ukraine and Russia. And he was, on balance, fairly sympathetic to the Ukrainian position, because obviously he was concerned that if Ukraine went under, well, Belarus might be absorbed too. But what's now happened is that he's tilting much more strongly towards the Russians than he had been before, and his relations with Ukraine basically have disintegrated. He clearly has no time for President Zelensky. And he was the other day, yesterday or the day before, in Moscow, and he met with Putin, and they were asked questions on Ukraine, and Lukashenko took a very strong pro-Russian position. At least he was echoing Putin's talking points about the Ukrainian situation to a remarkable degree. So I don't know whether Belarus would actually participate in a war, and I don't think the Russians need them. But of course, if they did, it would be a massive blow for Ukraine. And of course, the other thing that might happen is that it's conceivable that Lukashenko might allow Russian troops to transit into Ukraine via Belarus, which would be or every bit as devastating as as Belarus itself, the Belarus military itself becoming involved. Now, I don't know that's going to happen. This is all speculation. I want to make that very clear. But at least we can talk about it now, whereas a year ago it would have been inconceivable.
Yeah, that makes quite a bit of sense from Lukashenko's point of view. But from the military perspective, if the Belarusians were to be mobilizing as well and join in, because they're part of, was it the CSTO, if I remember the acronym correctly?
That's right.
You would have Ukraine effectively being attacked on 3 fronts. And as it currently stands, from my understanding, you've got the majority of the Ukrainian forces based on the contact line with the Donetsk area. So from the Russian viewpoint, you basically have to have one armored thrust from the north down to the south, reach the sea around Mariupol, and you've basically cut off 80% of all the Ukrainian armed forces.
Yeah, I agree. Now, look, I again stress I am not a grand strategist. I don't know whether this is possible, and I don't know whether the Russians or anyone at all has that kind of capability. It is the kind of thing that the Russians used to do superbly in the later stages of the Second World War, and it's the sort of thing that they exercise for. I mean, when they carry out exercises, I mean, they still seem to show tremendous flair in carrying out these giant envelopment exercises that we talk about. So I think they can do it. And by the way, I think they would do it. And I think they would do it in lightning speed. And it could very well end up in exactly the way you say it. Now, whether they need the Belarus military to be involved in that, I rather doubt. But I think that
agreed.
It's the sort of real possibility that we can't discount. I've been reading some very strange articles, I should say, in some parts of the media. There's a big article in the Financial Times which seemed to assume that, if there was a head-on war between Ukraine and Russia, the Ukrainians would be able to stand up for themselves. I don't think that's realistic at all. Actually,
no, I don't think so.
I think it's a fantasy. And it struck me again that the journalists who were writing this thing, who were civilians, by the way, like I am, seemed to assume that it would be a head-on clash between two armies, one marching towards the other.
Traditional warfare, yeah.
That kind of thing. And that isn't the Russian style of war at all. The Russians go in, as I said, for envelopment. And if you like, blitzkrieg, they don't fight in that kind of way. So I think that, if there was a war, that would probably be the shape that it would take. But, I don't think there's going to be a war. And to be very clear, I mean, it's not something I'm, pushing for or wish to see at all.
Oh no, of course not. Well, I volunteer. I used to until COVID hit. I used to volunteer in my local cadet unit, and I'm in London, by the way, in case anyone else in the world is wondering where I am. And I've met quite a few kids around 16, 17 years old who want to join the armed forces. Like, great luck to them. But I dread to think that if worse comes to worse, that these young kids that I'm saying goodbye to just as they become adults are the ones who are going to be sent off to Estonia and have to fight the Russian airborne troops, who are among the best in the world, if not the best at their task. Also, on the note of a military thing, that have you heard about I think it was the January exercises in Poland?
I have indeed. This is the one that the Poles tried, and found that they lost in 5 days or something like this.
It was against, from what I read, a supposed Eastern enemy, which I think we can all guess as to who they mean there. But their goal was to hold out 26 days, if I remember the article correctly, to allow Americans and Germans to mobilize and help them. And by day 4, the Polish Air Force and Navy had ceased to exist, and day 5, Warsaw had been taken, and the army had 70 to 80% casualties. So if that's Poland, what's the Baltics? What's countries like the Czech Republic? I mean, I don't need to denigrate the soldiers, but the actual command and control assets, the strategies, the locations of logistics centers, etc.
Yes. Again, I stress it once more. I'm not a military person, so I mean, I'm talking about things. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that in this situation, to imagine that any of these countries would be able to withstand the Russian military in that kind of way, I think is a fantasy. And I think people who talk in that way simply are not, again, engaging with the reality of the situation. I think people in the Pentagon understand this. At least I hope they do. And I think that they do. And I think they do not want to confront the Russians head on at something that the Russians have a history of doing exceptionally well. So I think that, they would probably avoid that. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that in the event of a war in Eastern Europe, certainly in Ukraine, as I said, it would all be over very decisively and perhaps within a relatively short time. I think a general war in Eastern Europe, I think one would very quickly discover that a lot of these countries are simply not up to fighting by themselves. The only militaries that count in Europe are those of the United States overwhelmingly, and I've heard Britain and France. I understand that even the German military isn't really up to that kind of standard anymore. Even the Polish military is not. So there we are. But again, I come back. I'm not an expert, so anybody.
Yeah, I'm a civilian myself, but nonetheless, I do my best to.
Well, at least
I'm a big military nerd, so.
At least you've been a cadet, which is more than I've ever been, I have to say.
Yeah, limits to it. I don't big it up or anything. There was also, I think it was last week when we were talking about Simon, and the guest Simon was talking about the PLA Navy building the equivalent of the French Navy every month or so. I have the slight suspicion he and I watched the same channel, Drakinifel, which I would recommend if you're interested in naval history at all. But it basically comes down to naval strategy as build strategy. And if you can outbuild in terms of ships your opponent, the Chinese do have a big card to play there.
Absolutely. There was a fascinating article, actually, that came out after we did that program, and it was by Scott Ritter. Now, Scott Ritter, is an ex-military person. He was a US Marine officer, and he was, of course, an intelligence official. And he said, and I'm sure what he's saying is absolutely correct, that the US has carried out 3 war games of a war in the Taiwan Straits, and China won conclusively the first 2, and the US won the third only by introducing into the war game weapon systems and capabilities which don't exist, and which in some cases are not even planned. So I mean that's again the reality. Now I don't want to push this too far. I don't want to push this too far. I mean, I think that the situation would change dramatically if the Chinese Navy would, to go up to the, the Gulf of Mexico exactly, and it was something of that kind, or, come to the West Coast. I think there the balance would shift decisively the other way. But near the Chinese coast, the Chinese are in a position of overwhelming strength, just as the Russians are.
It's a fundamental. It's much easier to defend than it is to attack. And whilst the Americans do have the numbers to reach out, I'm not sure they have the build strategy to survive the counterattack in the area.
Exactly. That's anyway. I mean, it's an interesting article by Scott Ritter, and as I said, he does speak with the authority of a military man, and a very well connected military man, who obviously knows what's being said and talked about in the Pentagon, which of course I don't.
Frank, if I may, just one last question though, a bit of an odd one. I don't really know how to word it aside from, do you encounter any sort of backlash against your views, sort of hostility? Because I, for instance, have been accused by my mother of all people of, she thinks I'm going to defect to Russia at some point, which I do end up laughing about quite a bit. But at the same time, considering how authoritarian Britain has become over recent months, I'm starting to think maybe it's not such a bad idea after all. But from my experience, if you say anything that's remotely pro-Russian in public, just with ordinary people, the amount of vitriol you seem to get back is almost disproportionate. And it's like you say you've encountered it. How do you deal with it?
Well, I just say, well, I'm entitled to my opinions and move on. I mean, I don't try to engage with all of this because I find it very difficult to. I find one gets drawn into arguments and then he begins to go off on odd sorts of weird and wonderful tangents. I try to keep very factual and very simple, and I point out that the facts I know, and I say, everybody's entitled to their own conclusions, but the facts are, as I've set them out. And as I said, sometimes one encounters some very strong reactions, some very, very strong reactions. I'm going to say this. I've tended to find that the strongest and most hostile reactions tend to come from the more, shall we say, elite sections of society. If you talk to sort of people lower down the social scale, they seem to be much less worked up about all of this. But there was one instance I can speak about, which was a very famous historian. I mean, I'm not going to name him, but somebody you will have heard of, got incredibly angry in my presence, not with me, but with my wife, when they were talking about one of these things. And this was at a social event, and he stormed out in fury that, you know, even these heterodox ideas were even being floated. And it did strike me that this is a historian who ought to be open to ideas and to contrary views. I mean, he didn't actually say that they were wrong. He simply said that he didn't want to hear them. So there we are.
Unfortunately, I know people like that.
No.
Right. Well, I won't keep you then. Thank you very much for talking. It's been an honor and a privilege. Oh, by the way, Alex, I think 2 years ago I bought a mug off you. My dad unfortunately dropped it on the floor, but the only thing that broke was the handle. So you can take that as evidence for your mugs being extremely well made.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, drop me an email. We'll get your dad a replacement.
Right. Thank you very much. Have a good
right.
evening,
Thank
you
you, James.
too, and have a good evening to everyone else.
Thank you. Take care.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.